Hey everyone, Mo here, and before the video begins, I just want to let you guys know that my schedule has opened up for me to do coaching again. So if you're interested in private one-on-one coaching for me to help you, whether you're a newer player and you want to excel at the game very quickly and learn the fundamentals without developing any bad habits early, or if you're an experienced player who's already maybe platinum or diamond and you're top 1%, but you need some help filling in the gap to get you to that 0.01%, to make you just some of the best, then hit me up on Discord and I can get you in some private one-on-one coaching lessons to help you polish up any skills you want to refine and help you learn all of the secrets to becoming a top player. That's it. I hope you enjoy the video. Hey everybody, Mo here, and in this video I'm bringing you a deck guide for dummies video on the Tahm Kench Soraka Deck. So in this video I'll go over how this deck plays out regularly. I'll tell you some of the more specific ways to play the decks in specific matchups, as well as towards the end we'll have a mulligan guide. So if you're interested in learning to play this deck like a Masters player, then make sure to stay tuned. Also, if you guys could do me a huge favor, I'm so close to hitting 1,000 subscribers on here. I believe I'm like 9 away from hitting 1,000 subscribers, and 86% of the people that watch my videos aren't actually subscribed to me. So if you could do me a huge favor in reaching my first milestone on YouTube by helping me reach that 1,000 subscriber mark, I'd greatly appreciate it. So that's it for the intro. Let's get into this deck guide. So to start things off, I'm going to go over each card, why it's in the deck, and the purpose in the deck for my specific build. I will have the deck code down in the description below, as well as a picture of the entire deck list here on the screen for you. So let's just start with the cheapest cards to the most expensive. So we'll start with Crusty Codger. It's a very staple 1-mana 2/2. It's good in both being aggressive against slow decks, as well as helping you stabilize against an aggressive opponent by putting a 1-drop unit. The fact that it can deal 2 damage to itself is crazy, because whenever you heal it with something like a Guiding Touch, or your Star Spring, or just any other heal effect, you essentially have a 1-mana 2/4. This is the best deck that can abuse cards like Crusty Codger and Boxtopus. These cards that have a super overstated stat line for their mana cost, for instance, they will never print an actual 1-mana 2/4. That stat line is way too busted. With Boxtopus, they will never print a 2-mana 3/4 that doesn't have a downside. Now, the reason this deck can feel so oppressive sometimes is because it takes those downsides of, oh, deal 2 damage to me, so it's really only a 1-mana 2/2. Or, oh, deal 3 damage to me, so I'm only playing a 2-mana 3/1 challenger. And it just removes those downsides. So now, if you curve into something like a Boxtopus on turn 2 and a Soraka on turn 3, all of a sudden, your Boxtopus is literally just a 2-mana 3/4. And on top of that, it helps level up your Soraka. There is no such thing as a downside of these deal damage to your units in this deck. It's so crazy. So anyways, I got off track a little bit, so we're gonna go back through the cards here. So yeah, your 1-drop here is Crusty Codger. It's really good 1-drop for being aggressive, as well as for blocking units early against aggro decks. I played 3 Shakedowns in my list because the fact that it deals 2 damage to an ally at burst speed is insane, and being able to grant your opponent's smaller units vulnerable allows you to further damage your own units. For instance, if they have a bunch of 1/1s on the board, then ideally when you attack, they're not going to block because they don't want to level up your Star Spring, or they don't want to level up your Soraka. Well, with Shakedown, this forces you to get super favorable trades in your favor. And a deck that doesn't have any removal otherwise, aside from Tahm Kench, this deck actually has no removal, and Shakedown is a pseudo way to remove cards, whether it's small unit so you can get, a little bit of damage so you level up your Star Spring or Soraka, or whether it's just a nice 3/3 or something, or a 3/4, and you just want to go ahead and make a trade that your opponent won't block with something like, let's say, a Misfortune. Well, if you have a 3-power unit, you can give Misfortune vulnerable, and now you're forcing her to block, and it's your best way to kill the Misfortune off. Your 2-drop here is Boxtopus. Again, like I said earlier, the fact that it's a 2-mana 3/4 that has the downside of dealing 3 damage to it is absolutely insane. Like, I'm not saying Riot should nerf this card, but this card definitely does not seem balanced to me, especially how often you just go Boxtopus on 2, Soraka on 3, and then now you're attacking with a 2-mana 3/4 challenger unit on turn 3. Like, there's not very many decks that can match that as far as just raw stats on turn 3 go, so it's kind of crazy. Your other 2-drops here are going to be Fortune Croaker. Fortune Croaker is really good in both the fact that it deals 1 damage to 2 of your units, Fortune Croaker and another unit. So that does something really well for things like Star Spring as well as Soraka. That makes your healing spread out a lot more. This card super synergizes with Star Spring. On top of that, it just draws you cards, so that way it's refilling its hand. So you can essentially look at this card as a 2-mana draw 1. And that's alone, 2 mana draw 1 card is pretty good, but now it's 2 mana draw 1 with a 2/2 body on top of it. This card is, if you think about the elusive unit, that's a 3 mana 1/2 draw card. This is a 2 mana 2/2 draw card, and it helps you win the game with your win condition like Star Spring. After that, we have Guiding Touch. This card is very simple. You can use it on your face if you're dying a little bit, or most of the time, it's just a nice little combat trick with your units, and it allows you to heal up all your units that have dealt damage to themselves. It helps you level up your Star Spring, as well as you can draw a card with Soraka. Hush, you only play 2 Hush in this deck. 3 Hush felt really, really clunky, so I went down to 2 Hush, and the reason is Hush is really needed against some matchups, like for the Lee Sin matchup, you kind of just win with Hush. In the Mirror match, you kind of just win with Hush. So Hush is a game ender in some matchups, and then completely useless in other matchups, so that's why I like 2 and not 3. Pale Cascade is really nice. It's one of the best cards in the game at the moment. It's just a nice little combat trip / cantrip where it buffs a unit mid-combat, as well as it draws you a card. So it's always nice to be drawing cards and refilling your hand. If you notice, this deck has a lot of card draw and draw engines. Your Guiding Touch draws you a card. Your Pale Cascade draws you a card. Your Soraka draws you a card. There's a lot of ways to draw cards in this deck. So you're always refilling your hand and never running out of threats. The other 2-drop is Star Spring. This is going to be one of your main win conditions against most decks. Rarely ever in the games that I've played have I ever smorked down an opponent, just straight up did 20 damage to them. A good majority of the games I played, I won with Star Spring triggers. And that's not necessarily saying that Star Spring is OP, or this deck can't smork people down. It's just, you'll find it be a lot easier to just heal your units 22 damage than it is to deal 20 damage with little, like, 2-power units. On top of that, I'm playing 1 Divergent Paths. 2 Divergent Paths felt really, really clunky. And I actually asked a friend of mine to Noise, who hit rank 2 with this deck, and is one of the, if not the best Tahm Kench Soraka player in Masters at the moment, consistently hitting top 5. I asked him what his opinions were on Divergent Paths, and he said if he ever played more than 1 Divergent Paths, he'd always draw 2 Divergent Paths. And it felt really, really bad. He said you rarely ever want 2 Star Spring in field at the same time, and he said anytime he played 2 Divergent Paths, he'd always find a way to have at least 2 Star Springs, or ways to have Star Spring in his hand. However, I feel like you can go up to 2 Divergent Paths if and only if this deck gets really, really big and you need it to destroy your opponent's landmarks. For instance, if half the games you end up playing, maybe after this upcoming balance patch, let's say Soraka Tahm Kench gets really, really good, then you might want to go up to 2 Divergent Paths, not because you need to draw your Star Spring, but because you need to destroy your opponent's Star Spring more than anything. I play 2 Lounging Lizards. I don't see a lot of lists that play Lounging Lizards. I like it because he is a nice little threat. He is a way to get under your opponent with the elusive. And again, this unit is just overly statted. It's a 3-mana 3/5, which is already good. But the fact that he's a 3-mana 3/5 elusive is absolutely crazy to me. So the fact that he deals 2 damage to him at the start of every round means literally nothing. Especially if you have a Star Spring in play, then it's, okay, deal 2 damage to me at the start of the round and then heal 1. So you're only dealing 1 damage to himself. If you have a Soraka with this card, I mean, you're just constantly healing this card up every single turn anyways. It's just a really nice way to pressure your opponent with a little bit of damage, as well as a really easy and free way to level things up like your Star Spring and your Soraka. The next card is Soraka. Now, Soraka's in here for very obvious reasons. When she attacks, she heals both herself and the supported ally for 4, which in this deck is going to be the entirety of people's healths except for Astral Protection and Tahm Kench. And the main reason you use Soraka is because you level her up almost instantly, and then she draws you a card every single turn, which is absolutely crazy. She's basically just guaranteed draw an extra card every turn. And it's super, super amazing. On top of, people don't think this is very relevant, but the support changes on leveled up Soraka to full heal me and my supported ally, which is actually a really, really big change when you do have something like an Astral Protection on your unit. Now, your unit goes from just gaining 4 health to gaining up to 8 health off of this Astral Protection and stuff like that. And it's really, really not irrelevant like a lot of people think it is. So the next card, and this personally, I think this is the best card in the game. Or not in the game. This is the best card in the deck, is Astral Protection. This combat trick is almost impossible to play around. Almost impossible for your opponent to kill something that's going to randomly gate up to 8 health. The only way they can quote-unquote play around this is with hard kill spells like Vengeance. Or Culling Strike, assuming that you don't have a Pale Cascade to make your unit bigger. But I believe, and I've talked with, again, the Noise about it, and he agrees with me, that Astral Protection is by far the best card in this deck. Not Tahm Kench, not Soraka, not Hush. It's actually just Astral Protection, because your opponent cannot play around this card well in almost every scenario. And it makes it leveling up your Star Spring and Soraka so easy and so fast. It's absolutely crazy. This card is by far one of the best cards that they released in the newest expansion, and it's easily the best card in this deck. And then we play 3 Bastion, because for very obvious reasons, I mean, Bastion just helps with Spell Shield in the mirror match, and makes it so your opponent's Tahm Kench can't eat things you don't want it to, and Bastion's just not a very balanced card, so it's really nice to put in your deck. You play 2 Broadback Protectors, helps a lot with the aggro matchup. I tried to play 3 Broadback Protectors, but again, it was one of those things where if you draw it in any matchup that isn't exactly aggro, it feels really, really bad. So I always just try and keep cards like that are very min-maxed of great in one matchup but terrible in every other matchup. I always try and keep those to a 1 or a 2 of. So that's why this is a 2 of. And then your last card in your deck is going to be Tahm Kench at a 3 of, because Tahm Kench River King is pretty crazy good card. It's impossible to lose in the mirror match. If you're attacking on odds, if you get priority on odds, you cannot lose in the mirror match, because you slam down Tahm Kench on 4, your opponent slams down Tahm Kench on 4. But now, going into the next round where you both get your acquired taste, you get to use yours first and just eat your opponent's Tahm Kench. So if you're attacking on odds and you both have Tahm Kench, you just win the game. And Tahm Kench is super crazy. It even eats things like Trundle. It can eat things like Lee Sin. And it's just so hard to actually kill a Tahm Kench. It's crazy. And then worst case scenario, if your opponent is about to kill your Tahm Kench after it's already eaten something of your opponent's, you can just hush your Tahm Kench, and then now your opponent won't get their unit back. So there's a lot of tricks with Tahm Kench. That's the reason for each card in the deck. Now, to go through and talk about the different playstyles per matchup, and to go through a full mulligan guide. So overall, this is a very snowball-y style deck. This deck allows you to run away with games if you're able to put your units into play, stick a Star Spring into play, and then protect them. And this works because the more your opponent tries to trade and remove your units, the more you're able to actually protect them and keep them alive. It's super easy for you to just completely snowball the game out of control, and you'll notice this once you start playing, that your Star Spring will look like, oh, it's at 5, triggers, it's at 6 triggers, and then all of a sudden your opponent tries to remove something or attack into you, and then boom, you cast an Astral Protection, you attack with the Soraka to get the heal and the support heal, and all of a sudden your Star Spring just went from 6 or 7 to literally 19, 20, 21, 22. Like, I've seen swings from your Star Spring go from 7 to 19 in 1 turn, and that's just from me playing it. I've seen other people go from 0 to 15 in 1 turn. But me personally, the most I've gotten is from 7 to 19. And that's absolutely crazy. Like, this deck is so snowbally. And another perfect example of that is Tahm Kench. Tahm Kench is so snowbally. If you can stick him and protect him, your opponent, again, is going to be impossible to remove Tahm Kench. Unless they have something super hard removal based, like a Vengeance or something like a Culling Strike, assuming you don't even have an answer to the Culling Strike, which you could easily do. So this is another one where just 2 mana every single turn, and now your Tahm Kench is just removing your opponent's units. They literally, you can get it to the point to where it's eating Tryndamirs, to where it's eating Ledroses, to where it's eating, Trundle super easily. And it just gets completely out of control, and your opponent just cannot handle it. So because of that, this deck is very, very snowbally, and the more you win the board trades, the better off you're going to be. So how do you win the board trades? How do you do that type of stuff? This is how. So let's start off with making sure that you always have mana open for spells. Yes, you can curve out units in this deck, but that's not always the best case scenario to do. Like, sure, you can play a turn 1 Conjure, you can play a turn 2 Boxtopus, but if your opponent is playing any removal spells at all, or a Challenger unit, or even a Make It Rain or something like that, well, now you just lost a 2 mana 3/4 for no reason. sometimes it's better just to maybe pass on turn 2 to hold open 2 spell mana. So now, when you play your Boxtopus, your opponent has to decide whether or not they want to invest cards to try and kill your Boxtopus, when you easily match it with something like a Guiding Touch. If your opponent tries to do something like Mystic Shot your Boxtopus, that means your opponent is spending 1 spell to try and remove your Boxtopus. If you respond to that with a Guiding Touch, you now have also spent 1 spell, but the difference is you saved your unit and you drew a card. So that means your opponent effectively spent 2 mana and spent a card to do absolutely nothing. And you come out super big on that trade, and then from there, you're now up a card on your opponent, and if you do this, 2-3 more times, you're now going to be up 3 cards on your opponent, and they're going to eventually just going to run out of a hand, and you're just going to have all these units in play. And so you're always going to want to look to see, is it worth playing my unit on curve, or is it better to just bank some of the spell mana to try and make sure I can keep my unit alive? The most common sequence I see of this is you have a Crusty Codger in your hand, a Star Spring in your hand, and a Guiding Touch in your hand. The most common sequence I'll do here is I'll actually pass on turn 1. On turn 2, I'll play Star Spring. And then on turn 3, that allows me to play either my Crusty Codger, or if you draw something like a Boxtopus, but play your Boxtopus, and then now you have at least 2 spell mana left open to be able to do a Guiding Touch and then save your unit. And now we're in the same spot where I just gave you the theoretical situation of, where if your opponent tries to remove it with some type of burn spell or damaging spell, you're going to Guiding Touch your unit. That's going to put 2 stacks on your Spring, which is helping you in the game, plus it's refilling its hand, plus your unit doesn't die, and then at the end of the turn, your Star Spring is going to heal your unit 1 again anyways, and makes it even harder to kill. So that is one of the most common sequences I have all of the time. And that's the perfect example to show you guys why sometimes spell mana is a lot more important to be used to save your unit than it is to just curve out your units on turns 1, 2, and 3. Now, this doesn't mean if you have both Boxtopus and Soraka in play to never play your Boxtopus on turn 2. But just keep in mind of your opponent's deck. If your opponent's playing Bilgewater, or they have something that can deal 1 damage very easily early on, or before you can actually attack with your Soraka, maybe, again, don't play your Boxtopus on turn 2. Just keep that mana back to keep your unit safe and alive. Because if you play a Boxtopus on turn 2 and they just respond with something like an instant Make It Rain or a Parlay or literally any spell because you're tapped out on mana or you have 1 mana at most here, then they're just going to be able to kill your unit for free and you just lost a very, very important key to winning the game. So the biggest tip of advice I can give you guys while playing this deck out is to always try and have mana saved so you can save your units instead of playing your units on curve. Now let's go ahead and just get into the mulligan guide, and I'm just going to go over the super relevant matchups that are out right now. And if you want a more updated version, you can always just join my Discord below. I will have a written out version of this deck and all of the mulligan guides for all of the relevant decks that come out and the future patches. So let's say that there's a deck that comes out if you're watching this video in a month from now, and the deck is still relevant, but there's also new decks that you need to mulligan for that aren't going to be in this video. Go over to my Discord, check out that document, and I'll have all of the updated decks and all of the updated ways to mulligan. So right now we're just going to go with the most relevant decks. So Lee Sin, this matchup is pretty even. It's really just a race, and it's a race of Lee Sin against Starspring. But we typically can win because we have Hush. So the priority to mulligan for is going to be Hush in this matchup, because you want to be able to Hush your Lee Sin, or your opponent's Lee Sin, and then that'll stop them from being able to OTK you, and that should buy you the 1 to 2 turns you need for your Starspring to win you the game. The next one will be Pirate Aggro. This matchup is favorable as long as you draw Broadback Protector. If you don't draw Broadback Protector and early game units, then this matchup is going to be pretty even. It's just going to come down to who can just draw better at that point. But as soon as you draw your Broadback Protector, the meter immediately swings in your favor. and the game just swings in your favor immensely. It's super crazy. The game plan for this is to just try and block early game units, because the pirate aggro is unique in where it can play early game units to aggro you down, but then it also has a lot of reach with stuff like decimates and Noxian Fervors. You want to try and mitigate as much damage as possible by blocking the cheap units. The next deck is going to be War Mother's Control. Now, this matchup, again, is pretty even. You don't really have anything you're special mulliganing for. Typically, when you're mulliganing in general, you're just going to want to look for early game units and then a Star Spring. So there's nothing really special when you do in this matchup. This matchup can be really tough late game whenever they ruinate you and you're like, pretty close to your Star Spring, but they ruinate you, and then now you don't have any units in play to heal for your Star Spring. However, depending on what your hand looks like, you can easily just rebuild after the ruination, because it takes your opponent an entire turn to ruination you. And all your units are pretty cheap, so you can easily put out 2 to 3 units depending on what your hand's looking like. Now, other than that, Bastion is probably one of the only things you want to priority mulligan here for, and that's just to keep your Tahm Kench from dying. If you land a Tahm Kench, then your Tahm Kench can start eating your opponent's Trundle, can start eating opponent's Ledge Roses if he gets big enough, and you just need to have a Bastion there to stop him from getting Vengeanced and Ruinationed. The next one is going to be the Mirror Match. So the Mirror Match, the only thing you really need is your Tahm Kench and your Divergent Paths. Divergent Path is to kill your opponent's Star Spring, and then Tahm Kench, because whoever's Tahm Kench lives the longest, or like can eat the other person's Tahm Kench, wins the game. So again, if you're attacking on odds in this game, which means you get priority on odd numbered turns, you're going to have a huge advantage, because if both of you play Tahm Kench on 4, then when it goes to turn 5, which is an odd number, you'll have first priority, which means you'll be able to use your acquired taste before your opponent's Tahm Kench. And then all you have to do then is eat your opponent's Tahm Kench, and then there you go. You now have a ginormous lead. Other than that, the biggest tip for this matchup is just fight for board presence. Use your shakedowns to try and kill off your opponent's units, and don't really worry about killing your opponent as much as just sticking a Star Spring and then fighting for board control. The next one we're going to talk about is TF Swain. TF Swain and TF GP are both unfavorable matchups. There's nothing you really need to prioritize in your mulligan, because in all honesty, this matchup is just so bad that it's like really hard for you to win because of things like Ravenous Flock, and they play obviously a bunch of good things like Scorched Earth or Noxian Guillotine, but because Scorched Earth not only kills any damaged unit, but it also just kills off your Star Spring, that's super annoying to deal with. On top of that, Swain has Fearsome, and almost every single unit in your deck, except for I think 1 or 2, have 2 power, so it's almost impossible to block a Swain if you don't also have a Pale Cascade in your hand. This matchup is just all around a nightmare. I'd try to avoid this. If you're running into a lot of TF Swain, TF GPs, I would just avoid playing this deck in general. The next match we're going to talk about here is going to be Discard Aggro, and this is going to be the last one on the list for important matchups. And this matchup is a lot like the Pirate Aggro, where it's favorable as long as you draw Broadback Protector, but it's also a little bit more favorable than Pirate Aggro, and that's just because Pirate Aggro has a lot more reach to the face with stuff like Decimates and Noxian Fervors, and Discard Aggro has kind of strayed away from the burn meta, and it's kind of just gone more with the go wide meta. So as long as you're just playing a bunch of early game units, if you draw a bunch of your 1-mana 2/2s, then you can just trade off with your opponent's units. You're going to look really good, and the only unit that your opponent can have that could cause you some fright is going to be a really big crowd favorite. They can make a 7/6 crowd favorite. However, we play Hush, so if you have a Hush for their crowd favorite, then you literally can't lose this matchup. There's 2 cards that you can draw, and the game is literally over, and it's Broadback Protector, Hush. If you can draw both of those cards, you cannot lose this matchup, and that's all but guaranteed. So that's going to be it. Those are the cards you want to look for in these specific matchups. Again, as the meta progresses and as there are more balance patches, these mulligan guides are going to change, because you're going to want to know what to mulligan for all the new decks that come out. And for that, I say go to my Discord, so that way you can check out the mulligan guides as they upgrade. And that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys got something out of it. I hope you guys enjoy this deck from here on out. I hope you learned something. Let me know in the description below, or in the comments below, what deck you guys want to see next for the deck guide for dummies videos, or if you have any other questions about this Tahm Kench Soraka deck, just let me know below. So that's going to be it. I'll see you guys in the next video.